Hello and welcome to a special episode of Nothing But the Truth. This week's India Today cover story reveals that Subhash Chandra Bose's family was kept under surveillance by the Nehru government and its successor for perhaps 20 years. Recently, declassified files have revealed significant, if not telling, details of this surveillance. And not surprisingly, the revelation has created a furor. But key questions still remain. Have the files been declassified in a selective and therefore prejudicial way? Could there be grounds that justify or at least explain the surveillance? Does it reveal Nehru's dislike or distrust of Bose? Does it suggest a casual, if not cavalier, attitude to surveillance? And now that the cat is out of the bag, do we need a formal inquiry? And should the rest of the Bose files immediately be made public? Those are the questions we should address over the next 1 hour with a special panel of guests. They are Subhash Chandra Bose's grandnephew and the Gardner Professor of History at Harvard University, Sugata Bose, the founding Vice-Chancellor of Ashoka University and the author of Nehru and Bose Parallel Lives, Rudrangshu Mukherjee, the former director of the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library and herself a famous historian, Mridula Mukherjee, the former governor of Bengal and former ambassador Gopal Krishan Gandhi, and the well-known pioneer and Times of India columnist, Swapan Das Gupta. Sugata Bose, you're Subhash Chandra Bose's grandnephew, and your father Sisir Bose and your uncle Amiyanath Bose were among the family members who were kept under surveillance for some 20 years from 1948 to 1968. How do you and your family react to this news?
Well, we were surprised to see the degree of the surveillance on both my father, Shishir Kumar Bose, and my uncle. I went to the National Archives myself last Monday and read through the files. Obviously, this was an unwarranted invasion of privacy of citizens of free India. What I found most disgraceful was that letters exchanged between my father and his aunt Emilie, Netaji's wife, were opened and read and copied. I was surprised because we had a very close and warm personal relationship with the Nehru family. Jawaharlal Nehru used to come and live as a guest at One Woodman Park, my grandfather Sharat Bose's home. In fact, I lived in a room up to 1974 which was referred to as Nehru's room because it was always left free for Nehru during his visits to Calcutta. And I'm speaking from 38 by 2 Elgin Road, the other house under surveillance. And, you know, even though my father's letters as head of the Netaji Research Bureau was being opened in the late 50s and early 60s, Nehru himself visited here in 1961, was shown around the museum by my father. I was there too. I see myself in the pictures as a 4-year-old. And since Nehru was so good with children, I apparently was charmed by him. So it is rather surprising to see that Nehru's government was carrying on this surveillance.
Can I ask you a quick question? At the time, this surveillance lasted for 20 years. Did your father or your uncle or any other member of the family have any sense or feeling that you were being watched, that your phone calls were being listened to, that your letters were being read? Did you have any inkling at all?
No. My father used to tell us how he used to be tailed in British days whenever he traveled from home to medical college, and how both houses were under very strict intelligence and police surveillance, not least in 1941 when they had to fool the intelligence in order to have Netaji escape from the house.
But not after independence.
But not after independence. There was one instance in 1958 when my father was traveling to the United States to go to Harvard Medical School and the Children's Hospital there. There was an inordinate delay apparently in renewing his passport, and he had been told that his name was on a blacklist from British days and had not been removed. But now I can see from the intelligence files that they were actually following his movements even in 1958. But beyond that, he did not believe that Free India would treat a freedom fighter like him in the manner that he was apparently you know, subjected to.
Rudrangshu Mukherjee, let me bring you in at that point. in its official response, the Congress has questioned why only notings on the file of the two declassified files have been released, whilst the correspondence portion of those same files has been withheld. Congress claims this is selective leaks and half-truths, and it asks the question, does the correspondence portion contain some inconvenient truth, which is why it's been withheld? Do you think the Congress has a point?
The Congress has a point, but the more important point is, why aren't all these files being declassified? What is the point? I mean, the Congress government refused to do it. Now the present government is not too willing to do it either. I don't understand files that pertain to the 1940s. Why should they be withheld from public viewing, from the view of
sure. Your wider point is very well received.
History, I resent that.
Your wider point is very well received.
There is also another point, I think,
talking specifically about these two declassified files, do you accept that there's something strange about the fact that only the notings on the files have been declassified, that the correspondence portion hasn't? And do you accept that that perhaps leads Congress to question whether the correspondence portion reveals something that's inconvenient, which is why it's been withheld? Do you accept that point with regard to these two files?
No, I don't accept that point completely. If what the Congress is true, it is very strange indeed that it has been declassified in this particular point. But this could be an act of sheer negligence and in fact stupidity, rather than of any grand design.
Okay. You know, Mr. Mukherjee, regardless of what's been withheld, what is undeniable is that the Bose family was under surveillance for nearly 20 years. The key question is, were there at that time credible grounds to justify or at least explain the surveillance? What's your answer to that question?
See, one, of course, is working with a lot of speculation because one hasn't seen these files. You don't know exactly why they've been declassified, why only two files are declassified. But to answer your question in a broader framework, I suspect that this surveillance, one, could have been a continuation of the colonial period surveillance, which happened very often in the Indian police and administrative system.
You mean it carried on unthinkingly?
Sometimes. I mean, I've seen records where I have asked, why is this file still closed? And there's no reason ever, but it's just closed, or somebody's still classified as a dangerous element.
What is the other reason?
However, my main argument would be that we know that there was surveillance of left-wing parties, individuals, leaders, cadre, even student activists in the 50s and 60s. We know that people who had been active, even let's say in the Students' Federation, when they would sit for the IAS, it would take a long time for their names to be cleared. A famous historian, Irfan Habib, who was a member of the Communist Party as a student, he got a scholarship to England. Apparently, it took intervention at a very high level for him to enable to. Now, I think given that the forward bloc, in which Sarat Bose, after he broke with the Congress fully in 47, and then his family members as well were active. Forward Bloc was a left-wing organization. It had collaborations also with the Communist Party of India in various places, its own ideology, its own stand.
So that's a reason.
It's possible. I'm only saying possible.
Absolutely.
I cannot say what it is without seeing the material.
That I understand.
I'm only talking in general terms.
Absolutely. I understand we're only speculating about the possible reasons why, in fact, this surveillance of the Bose family happened. Gopal Krishnan Gandhi, let me put to you another speculative possible explanation for this surveillance. Could it be the fact that Subhash Chandra Bose had links with Mussolini and Hitler, that he flirted, if that's the right word, with fascism and Nazism, and given that in the 40s and 50s India was a fragile democracy, could one therefore say that one other reason for the surveillance is the Nehru government's apprehension that the Bose family could be a conduit for the spread of the influence of fascism or Nazi influence, and therefore they were keeping an eye on the family? Could that be one explanation?
I believe we are speculating too much. There is no indication of what is called application of mind by the head of government, that is Jawaharlal Nehru, in this matter. There is complete clarity now that Shishir Bose and Omia Bose were under surveillance, which is a preposterous thing to have happened. But there is nothing to suggest in the papers that have so far been seen and discussed that Nehru himself asked for these two young men to be placed under surveillance.
Well,
so
I need to contradict you there, Mr. Gandhi. Mr. Gandhi, I need to contradict you there. There is, in fact, in the papers a conversation that Nehru had in November 57 with the then Foreign Secretary Subimul Dutt, when he explicitly asks Dutt to ask the ambassador in Japan to keep an eye on Amirnath Bose during a visit Bose was paying to Tokyo, and specifically to find out whether he visited the Renkoji temple. That is there in the India Today story. So clearly Nehru at one point at least did ask for Amirnath to be surveilled and to be watched.
Well, if he asked the Indian ambassador to tell him what these two young Bose gentlemen were doing in Japan, that is one thing. I think that is on a very different footing from his asking for a 24/7 surveillance on two houses and on two persons.
Okay.
I do not say that this did not happen. I am saying we do not know whether it happened. And even if it happened without Nehru's instructions, I think it was preposterous.
Well,
but
okay.
we should not assume that here are two persons who have been specifically spotted and identified by Jawaharlal Nehru to be placed under surveillance.
All right,
I think
let's come to this question.
Very far-fetched and tendentious decision.
Let's come to the question how much Nehru knew and whether this was being done at Nehru's behest in a moment's time. Let's stick for now to undoubtedly speculation about why the surveillance was happening. We'll come to the question of responsibility later. Swapan Das Gupta, I want to quote to you something that's there in the India Today cover story. It says, and I'm quoting, in one 1949 letter, which the IB intercepted and read, Amia Bose asks Sisir Bose, then a medical student in London, to find out whether any of the German generals were once again active in West Germany, particularly Hitler's former chief of staff, General Franz Holder. Does that provide some speculative ground for believing that the IB or someone who gave instructions to the IB were worried that the Bose family could be conduits for Nazi and fascist influence, as I was suggesting a moment ago?
Well, I think that would be carrying it a bit too far. I think what is clear, what needs to be established is whether the surveillance of the Bose family, which undoubtedly existed right up till 46, 47 probably, took a break and then was resumed at the instance of the ministers of post-independent India. Now, if you recall, in 1948, Sharat Chandra Bose had become an important figure in the non-Congress movement in Bengal. He won a by-election in Calcutta at that time, and it was always possible that he would become a nucleus of an emerging anti-Congress alliance. Now, unfortunately, he died within 2 years, so that thing couldn't really happen. But I think there was always, to my mind, a fear and the larger issue that monitoring of the Bose family was necessary to understand the dynamics of the anti-Congress movement and to what extent they would actually play on the Netaji legacy, which had a very vibrant appeal in Bengal at that time.
Okay.
Now, one of the bases of intelligence is that governments should never be surprised. And to my mind, the rationale, the possible rationale, and that doesn't justify the ethics of the whole thing, was that they wanted to know what an important political family was getting up to, and whether this meant corresponding with German generals, etc., or corresponding with the Japanese people who had helped Subhash Chandra Bose in Japan at the INA. These were part of the whole thing. So to my mind, there was a fear that that the Netaji legacy could be used in some way which would be inimical to the Congress government, and I would therefore presume that that formed the basis of the constant surveillance of these two at that time very young people.
Okay, Shugata Bose, I want to go back to that reference I read a moment ago to the letter in 1949 where it suggested that Sisir Bose was asked to contact a particular lot of German generals to find out if they were still active. Your mother has told India Today that in fact your father was only trying to gather material to set up a Netaji Research Foundation. That foundation was set up through correspondence. On the other hand, the India Today article says that the Intelligence Bureau believed otherwise. They thought that your uncle Amiya Bose and your father Sisir Bose were attempting to form an Azad Hind Dal comprising former INA men. And I'm asking you this question as a historian rather than as a member of the Bose family. How do you respond to the IB's interpretation of that letter?
Well, in the late 1940s, I can understand a reason for the surveillance because Sharat Chandra Bose was still alive until February of 1950, and having been a congressman all his life and having been the leader of the Congress party in the Central Legislative Assembly as late as 1946, he had broken with the Congress on the partition question and was opposing the Congress at that time. You have to recognize that my father had resumed his medical studies after spending many years in prison in the mid-1940s, and he was a medical student doing his DCH in London, and I think this one letter from his elder brother doesn't prove very much. But what my mother has said is about a later period. My father founded the Netaji Research Bureau in 1957. And then he wrote letters to Netaji's associates in different parts of India and also in Europe and Asia, asking them to send photographs, documents, letters, and so forth. So this was after 1957, and clearly the surveillance increased in 1958 because all of my father's letters clearly were being opened in 1958. Now, my father, for example, was writing to the mother of a German submarine officer who had taken photographs of the famous submarine journey that Netaji took in 1943. And that woman replied to my father saying that her son had taken these pictures and said someone from India will one day ask for them, and her son was killed on his next mission. And so those are the kinds of correspondence that my father was carrying out.
I understand.
He, as a freedom fighter, wanted to preserve the best traditions of the freedom movement, and he wanted a proper history of the freedom movement to be recorded. But the government may have had a misapprehension that he was using this as a basis for mounting a later political challenge. He also invited INA officers and veterans. In fact, it was a thrilling experience for me as a child to meet all of the INA officers, men and women, who worked closely with Netaji. He was getting them to make speeches and to record their memoirs.
And the government may have misunderstood all of this. I take your point. And the government may have misunderstood all of this.
That he was going to,
sure, I take your point. Let's then move on.
He was doing.
Let's then move on. Rudanshu Mukherjee, BJP spokespersons and in fact, to be honest, BJP ministers are convinced that the surveillance reflects Jawaharlal Nehru's dislike of Bose and therefore his suspicion of the Bose family. You've already heard in an earlier answer Shugata Bose point out that in fact Nehru would frequently visit them. He was very good with the Bose family children. He was a frequent visitor to their home. You've in addition written about the relationship between Bose and Nehru. Did Bose and Nehru dislike each other, and more importantly, did Nehru dislike Bose?
I have no evidence to say that either of them disliked each other. In fact, through the 1930s, one can only describe them as being very close comrades, discussing political issues together, reading the same books together. Subhash Bose was actually present with Nehru when Kamala Nehru died, helped Jawaharlal to make the funeral arrangements, and Subhash Bose turns to Nehru for advice and support at every single critical juncture, even during the famous or notorious Tripuri crisis, when he is trying to confront and persuade Mahatma Gandhi. It is to Nehru that he turns and he says, you know, I am in Dhanbad, I'm convalescing from a fever and I need to discuss certain things. Could you come down? You are the only person I can talk to and discuss these matters. And Nehru writes to Gandhi and says, you know, Subhash wants me to come and I cannot say no to Subhash. And he travels to Dhanbad from Allahabad to discuss
this BJP claim.
They were very, very close.
So the BJP claim that Nehru disliked Bose is complete baloney. To use a colloquialism.
And there was Nehru admitted this, Subhash admitted this, there was a political and ideological difference between the two of them from 1939 onwards.
Okay.
Before that, they were actually comrades together on the same side within the Congress against what Bose very rightly called the right wing of the Congress. And after, when Nehru got the report of the air crash in which it was presumed that Bose had lost his life, he was very deeply affected, and he went on, as is well known, he went on to defend the INA prisoners, heard from them about Bose's heroism, and
I think
the fact that of
I
his
think you made that
secularism
point
and
very
that he had
effectively,
stood up to Japanese bullying. So he also completely, whatever little reservations he had, ideological reservations he had about Bose, he completely abandoned them and in fact praised him and claimed him as
I'm
being
stopping you
a
because I
younger
think you
brother.
made the point very, very effectively that there's really no question of Nehru disliking Bose, and BJP ministers and spokesmen claiming that's the cause of the surveillance is just nonsense. Gopal Gandhi, they are speculating about one other possible reason that could explain the surveillance, and I know you're averse to speculation, but I'm afraid that is something we need to do to try and understand why that surveillance happened. And that reason seems to be the belief that maybe Subhash Chandra Bose wasn't dead. Maybe he hadn't died in that plane crash, and the Nehru government believed that if he was alive, the one lot of people he would make contact with was his family, and that perhaps is an explanation for this surveillance. Do you buy that?
I do not buy that at all. I do not think there was the slightest doubt in the minds of the government about Netaji's whereabouts, which were at that point non-existent, which means that he was gone. He had died. Sugata Bose himself, in his brilliant biography, Brothers Against the Raj, Opponents of the Raj, His Majesty's Opponents, has said very clearly that no doubt exists that Netaji died on that date.
So any speculation that the surveillance is motivated by a desire to try and find out whether Subhash Chandra Bose is alive, you believe is just rot?
Do you think that keeping the letters of two young members of the Bose family under surveillance was going to lead to some grand discovery of Netaji languishing in a Russian jail? I am sorry. That is far-fetched beyond description. What has happened definitely is that these two men were kept under surveillance for a variety of reasons which may have had nothing to do with the center, which may have had nothing to do with Jawaharlal Nehru, but everything to do with the culture of surveillance which Dr. Mrudula Mukherjee very rightly pointed out.
Let's
surveillance culture which has marked every government, including that government of Nehru.
I want to point out to you, Mrs. Mukherjee.
One second, Mr. Thapar. I think it's very important that we know this. Chief ministers are very powerful people, and I know this for a fact that in the 50s and 60s, chief ministers were even more powerful than they are today. And I think we should try to find out if Dr. B.C. Roy had something to do with keeping the Bose family under
All right, you may be right, except that I wonder whether chief ministers can give instructions for surveillance to the Intelligence Bureau, which comes under the central government, and specifically, and this is something that people who are commenting on this have forgotten, at that time came under the Home Minister. And the first Home Minister it would have come under would have been Sardar Patel, not the Prime Minister. But let's leave that aside because we don't have the answer to that. I want to raise with you the one instance in the India Today story where clearly Nehru himself took an interest. When Amiya Bose went to Japan in November 57, Nehru asked Subimal Dutt, then the Foreign Secretary.
By him. So it is rather surprising to see that Nehru's government was carrying on this surveillance.
Can I ask you a quick question? At the time, this surveillance lasted for 20 years. Did your father or your uncle or any other member of the family have any sense or feeling that you were being watched, that your phone calls were being listened to, that your letters were being read? Did you have any inkling at all?
No. My father used to tell us how he used to be tailed in British days whenever he travelled from home to medical college, and how both houses were under very strict intelligence and police surveillance, not least in 1941 when they had to fool the intelligence in order to have Netaji escape from the house.
But not after independence.
But not after independence.
Bag. Do we need a formal inquiry, and should the rest of the Bose files immediately be made public? Those are the questions we should address over the next 1 hour with a special panel of guests. They are Subhash Chandra Bose's grandnephew and the Gardner Professor of History at Harvard University, Sugata Bose, the founding Vice-Chancellor of Ashoka University and the author of Nehru and Bose, Parallel Lives, Rudrangshu Mukherjee, the former director of the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library and herself a famous historian, Mridula Mukherjee, the former governor of Bengal and former ambassador Gopal Krishan Gandhi, and the well-known pioneer and Times of India columnist Swapan Das Gupta. Sugata Bose, your Subhash Chandra Bose's grandnephew and your father Sisir Bose and your uncle Amiya Nath Bose were among the family members who were kept under surveillance for some 20
with the Nehru family. Jawaharlal Nehru used to come and live as a guest at One Woodburn Park, my grandfather Sharat Bose's home. In fact, I lived in a room up to 1974 which was referred to as Nehru's room, because it was always left free for Nehru during his visits to Calcutta. And I'm speaking from 38 by 2 Elgin Road, the other house under surveillance. And, you know, even though my father's letters as head of the Netaji Research Bureau was being opened in the late 50s and early 60s, Nehru himself visited here in 1961, was shown around the museum by my father. I was there too. I see myself in the pictures as a 4-year-old. And since Nehru was so good with children, I apparently was charmed.
20 years from 1948 to 1968. How do you and your family react to this news?
Well, we were surprised to see the degree of the surveillance on both my father, Shishir Kumar Bose, and my uncle. I went to the National Archives myself last Monday and read through the files. Obviously, this was an unwarranted invasion of privacy of citizens of free India. What I found most disgraceful was that letters exchanged between my father and his aunt Emilie, Netaji's wife, were opened and read and copied. I was surprised because we had a very close and warm personal relationship.
Hello and welcome to a special episode of Nothing But the Truth. This week's India Today cover story reveals that Subhash Chandra Bose's family was kept under surveillance by the Nehru government and its successor for perhaps 20 years. Recently, declassified files have revealed significant, if not telling, details of this surveillance. And not surprisingly, the revelation has created a furor. But key questions still remain. Have the files been declassified in a selective and therefore prejudicial way? Could there be grounds that justify or at least explain the surveillance? Does it reveal Nehru's dislike or distrust of Bose? Does it suggest a casual, if not cavalier, attitude to surveillance? And now that the cat is out of the